the next session I'm really excited about. We've got a little range of speakers who are going to do some quick-fire presentations to collectively get your mental juices flowing and thinking about what the future might hold for us as landscape architects. So, first speaker is Dr. Hannah Hopewell, and she is an educator and a practice-based researcher at Te Herenga Waka of Victoria University and kaupapa Māori at Tuia Architects. Hannah is an innovative researcher challenging new ways of thinking about our urban environments and landscapes. So, welcome, Hannah.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you very much, Renee. So, this is a big, wide audience. Okay, so I'd like to acknowledge mana whenua here first, and particularly this ridgeline upon which we stand, the ridgeline, the Walk of Hape, and just acknowledging the journey through Karangahape over many centuries. I'd also like to thank the organisers. It's a real privilege to be speaking here, and amongst you all. I'd like to thank my past teachers and my present teachers, which I have many. And I guess the last thing before I get into the talk proper is who am I? So you heard some titles. So yep, I teach at the University of Te Herenga Waka in Wanganui-o-Tara. And I also practice with kaupapa Māori Toa Architects from the last couple of years. So I'm kind of a pracademic, I think is the term these days. I'm not sure how well that word's socialised, but it seems to be quite fitting for how my diary looks. So who am I? I identify as tangata tiriti or Ngāti Pākehā. My people come from the north of the UK, or more specifically Northumberland, and also from a place called Diss, or in Suffolk. And my father, he's the fourth generation on my father's side, but my mother only came to New Zealand in the late 60s. So why the tangata tiriti status, I guess, is critical for me, for us all, I guess, is that it defines my responsibilities in regards to partnership, in regards to encompassing what citizenship means for me here as Ngāti Pākehā here in Aotearoa. So I'm going to talk about, let me just get this green button right. The title of this talk is Unsettling Settling, Why Landscape Architecture Needs to Think About the Politics of Design. So I'd like to share a few reflections on what attention to the political might mobilise for our current landscape practices. So in short, the short response to that question is the political is perennially a neglected area of landscape architectural inquiry, and that's particularly evident in Aotearoa. So this talk I'm going to give relates in part to a growing body of international thought and research in landscape democracy and landscape justice. Landscape, as we will all attest, is a milieu of situated everyday practices in which people make place and places make people. Key here is this inextricable relation, and this way of thinking about landscape is proving a powerful concept of conceiving of politics and citizenship as lived, dialogic and emplaced, and implies that we are in relation and that we are in a particular type of relation, which is in our case with mana whenua here and manahiri, a partnership. So landscapes make manifest many lines of relation occurring across and with living beings. As designers, we know this, but really do we attend to what landscape justice and landscape democracy might afford? Now, I hope I'm going to get these clicks right. Okay. There's a little bit of the international kind of context, a few books. So I think it's timely to question how our practices are entangled in not just the pursuit of betterment which we've been quite preoccupied with since in the period of modernity, and how we might be how we might move aside from pursuing betterment, optimism, and the promise of adaptation and regeneration of our troubled world. So I'm not saying that these are not important things, they certainly are, but what I'd like to kind of emphasise is that our practices are equally complicit in sustaining capitalist accumulation and the systematic extractive practices that underpin injustices brokered by our settler colonial context. So I'd like to think that landscape architecture works beyond the techno-scientific, beyond its will to fix and to stabilise, and more in and with these everyday lived relations. Now, Swedish geographer Tim Malz writes, landscape has remained largely absent from spatial and environmental justice writings, and any will to justice has made little bearing upon landscape architectural practices. This failure to engage with justice is a core issue for any politics of landscape, and points to a wholesale and sustained depoliticisation of our practices. De Block, Vera Vinsotti and Dietrich, in a recent special edition of the Journal of Landscape Architecture, recently point out that landscape architecture has often served, unwittingly perhaps, yet nonetheless efficiently, as a frame for aggressive, market-driven and elitist interventions, exacerbating gentrified and depoliticised urban form. Landscape architectural rhetoric, more aligned to altruistic ends with techno-scientific motivations, tends to overlook how its practices entangle in power relations. Critical landscape inquiry might aim to address how landscape representations have power and agency over land, yet efforts to understand the geopolitical power of landscape in systems of settler colonialism and how the very idea of landscape is bedded in underlying coloniality is rarely pursued. Landscape, like space, is not the innocent and depoliticised context of social interactions. Instead, the spatiality of landscapes is produced by social interaction and plays a key role in producing and reproducing power and identity. Given accelerating social and environmental inequity, there is some urgency for landscape architecture to develop both awareness and agency in navigating this complexity. It seems that vocabulary, or how we talk about landscape, is a critical kind of hinge to this intention. So if colonialism is about the control of land, then conversely, read my notes here, and then conversely, decolonisation requires the complete subversion of the powers controlling that land. So decolonisation starts with land, and with this, a landscape architecture is clearly implicated. So there was growing international insight in how landscape as a relational practice is implicated in these power relations, yet my interest here is where the political and landscape meet is less theoretical. I'm interested in more of a situated response, and I'm interested in what emerges from experience of and attendance to localised landscape concerns when taking a political viewpoint. Positively, in the present era, in many ways, there are shifts being endorsed to redress the balance of power in Aotearoa, and I'm sure it is the hope of all of us here that in the near future we might know what reconciled landscapes look like. Yet whilst we collectively track that journey for landscape architecture, we must not forget that the Western idea of landscape was, over much of its history, and still to a degree is, closely bound up with the practical, often violent appropriation of land. Well, back one. Australian academic Fiona Johnson is not alone in highlighting that landscape architecture and urban design practices trace their lineage from the tactics of colonisation through the map maker and the surveyor, and that our practices, no matter how naturalised, wield fine-grained spatial technologies of power. Thus, despite landscapes emerging from deliberate political and social intentions, they often appear as naturalised or natural, with all ideological biases effectively hidden in plain sight. In Aotearoa, this invisibility begs the question of the historical complicity of design in imposing and maintaining racialised hierarchies of privilege, access, identity, and notions of belonging. As the late rangatira Moana Jackson has said, or recently said, everything has whakapapa. Hence, for those of us tangata tiriti or people of the treaty, in order to make space for a reformed and just spatial and landscape-based relation, the specificity of landscape's past, how it bears upon the present landscape, and how the present habituated practices continue to be complicit, need to be acknowledged. Hence, this presentation attempts to open up the question of ways tangata tiriti landscape architects might be with and respond to the settler colonial lineage within which we work. Landscape is indeed one of those murky words. Not only does it have multiple definitions, it mobilises to different effect. It frequently conflates with or is used interchangeably with environment and land. Yet these ideas host a very different set of associations. The excellent Te Tanga Manu recites this epistemic diversity in such a way that supports navigating this kind of redefinition or mobilising redefinition of various different understandings of landscape in Aotearoa. Landscape, but as we know, landscape is a thoroughly Western idea, emerging in the Enlightenment period, and whose imagination found its way to the whenua of Aotearoa by way of what we call colonisation. As we well know, there is not a term for landscape in Te Reo, and thus no such separation from human to place, and evident in Te Ao Māori cosmogony. Ranganui and Papatuanuku, from everything that ultimately descends, ensure that everything is related and interconnected. Now, given French anthropologist Augustine Burke informs us that Westerners traditionally see and think landscapes, whereas others have worlds, tells us a lot about the different worldviews. Geographer Dennis Cosgrove, foregrounds landscape as not an object or an image, but a way of seeing. That this root, and it's one that's rooted in ideology and represents the way in which a given class has represented its property to itself. The landscape idea represents this way of seeing, a way which for some Europeans has represented to themselves and to others the world about them and the relationships with it, and through which they have commented on social relations. So landscape is thus a vehicle for distancing us Western worlds in critical ways, defining a particular relationship with nature and who gets to appear in nature. It is not such a leap to see how these Western-founded landscape imaginations are key players overriding potential acts of reciprocity, with these acts of appropriation for land and the insertion of individualised ownership means. So how do tangata tiriti practising landscape architects, how do we acknowledge and move with this legacy? So for clarity, I want to emphasise the approach to this research practice that I undertake here is I try and take a way of working with what I find, rather than examining about. And that might seem like a pretty clunky statement there, but it signals an ontological shift in my bearing. So if I'm researching with whatever is being uncovered rather than with distance about it. So the research practice for myself takes on this form of relationality. This approach enables my tangata tiriti positionality as both critical witness and actant. And it designates my own entanglement within these issues rather than having any distance or sovereignty, particularly sovereignty, over them. So it's therefore not my ambition for this variant of research to become, be an expert or claim any totalising position here, but rather gain some insight into the conditions as they are arising. This is gaining insight into landscape justice as they are arising within. So why landscape architecture needs to think about the politics of design, as I've indicated, takes on a settler colonial lens. Through the introduction of settler colonialism as a complicating power dynamic, it becomes possible to witness how unconscious spatial perceptions are brought into landscape change. Any move towards decolonisation and reconciled landscapes require an understanding of settler colonialism and the forms of unsettling or disruption of the kinds of conceptual monopolies and universalising tendencies hidden within our practices and our discipline. Unsettling is not a clear or straightforward process, but a constant re-evaluation of current systems to identify and dismantle the mechanisms of power and those mechanisms that put them in place. So what follows, I will contextualise the political a bit more overtly, a bit more clearly, and I'll talk through just a couple of projects briefly and then conclude with a few points on how I see this potential changing context for our practices taking place. So the political, what does the political afford? Oh, I'm really behind here. Sorry about that, that's disjunctive. What does the political afford? And by the political, I don't mean political parties or political politics. What is, that is the promoting or defending of one point of view over another, but rather how we figure or what is constitute of a common world. So I bring this into focus because landscape design is the imagination of common worlds that emerge in the tangle of material and the political. I bring this into focus because the political bearings of our practices address the relational dimension of an issue or the relationships constituting a landscape. So for me, I'm saying here that attentiveness to the political allows us to look more carefully and closely at the relational dimensions that make up our landscapes. The political therefore emphasises who and whom is involved in a landscape. It attends to the who is counted, who is seen, who is effaced, and who benefits. It helps us to sharpen to whom we are responsible and for whom our practices attend. The political draws around the movement of power and systemic power relations acting through landscapes and landscape practices. It opens questions of how design has historically served to distribute and exercise power, and in turn, what might be just landscapes or what might be reconciled landscapes. The political thus enables us to see things as they are and potentially how they may be changed. So, I'm going to talk to a couple of projects now and finish up with a few points. How's my time? I'm looking at the timer and I can't see it. Oh no, I'm good. Okay, so this first project, or two projects I want to speak to, are written pieces of work. What they're intending to do is actually get beyond landscape. So acknowledge the legacy of landscape that I laid out before and acknowledge a reframing and how it's transiting. So the first one is a publication in this book called The Politics of Design. It's a dialogue text based that I did with Dr. Rod Barnett. And we chose to do a dialogue or quite a poetic kind of approach to this idea, given we didn't want to be experts or anything in this area, but actually narrate things in our worlds as we could understand them. So the work itself speaks to appropriation and displacement in Aotearoa through analogies of gardening and urban design. Through a discursive and auto-ethnographic dialogue, so you get to hear about my dog and all kinds of things like that, we explore the creation of the oppressive spatial categories of the colonial episteme, which systematically sought to convert land into landscape and territory. We show how harbours, bridges, railroads and roads are implicit in the production of relationships between land, body, notions of performativity, entanglements and interactions. We take this poetic language as it gives a poignant view on the invasion and invasiveness of the continuing dominant colonial trope that is emblematic in the landscape. This process is kept alive in the text by way of, or kept alive in the landscape by way of the colonial episteme, complicit in the education of landscape architects. The designed and constructed are considered as measures both to provide and to cut off access and to control movements. Our dialogue we see is we see the kind of garden that becomes a sort of microcosmic landscape in the hands of the individual, and narrate various different changes and moves and relate them to past, present and cultural bearings. The second project, which is an article on the screen there, I won't talk to because I'm kind of out of time, but it narrates the similar ideas but in a different sort of style. A second project I'll speak to is Ko Wai O, Who Am I? It's an installation or practice-based research investigation, primarily concerned with land development practices. That's practice-based work, and it was most concerned with the perception and related modification of landform. So relatedly, the very idea of landscape and how landscape as a spatial technology is transited in imagination is as much a part of this concern as is the default mobilisation of the cut and fill. So I see the cut and fill as a key technology, just naturalised in our processes, and so I wanted to look at it a little more closely. So I was concerned about the pursuit, what I call the pursuit of flatness, as associated with dwelling, and techniques of cut and fill embedded in the cultural imaginary of settler colonial processes governing Aotearoa. Radical modification of terrain across scale that alters the body of the earth, the horizons of history as told by the soil and the form of the land itself. So such radical modification is of course challenging on many fronts, yet mana whenua are so deeply pained by these kind of wholesale, I should have some photos, wholesale land modifications, and so far from honouring tēnā rangatiratanga. I realise I'm quite out of time, so I might just skip that a little more and just speak to the project itself, which you can see by some of the images here. This project was an exhibition. It had 4 cubic metres of soil that was gifted by Ngāti Tō Rangatira from a land development site that they were progressing in Kenaparu in Porirua. And the soil was kind of taken and housed and cared for as a way of acknowledging the ontological status or entity, a living entity of the soil in of itself. And through time, it grew things, which we'll see in a minute. And so on. It's now been repatriated. There was another piece to this work which was a sound work, and so I wrote a 10-minute poem that then was recorded and then with speakers was narrated for those that experienced the exhibition. So clearly I'm illustrating different ways of doing research in regards to some of our environmental concerns, and while at one level just highlighting problems is not part of the solution. What I'm trying to say, if we make a bit of space before we jump to sort of techno-scientific solutions, that we can actually develop some solidarity around and vocabulary and shared understanding about how these things evolve in the first place. Now, the last project that I'll just highlight is what I call hypervisible taxonomies. This project is set about by asking how could landscapes be approached and narrated if the impacts of global capital's primacy is fully recognised. It looks to what's hidden in plain sight. It looks for the power relations and the depth of our landscapes, and it looks to the systems that create them. It's a visual and mapping-based approach, and will end up in a publication and a taxonomic kind of approach. So I'm actually going to flick right through now because I've been really missing my keeping to time. And just to conclude, which is not actually a conclusion at all, but a kind of a summary for here and now, is to answer the question really that I was attempting to provoke, why look at politics and landscape architecture practices? What I think it affords is this. So it allows us to open new ontologies, ways of recomposing inherited divisions between forms of life. It helps us to see the constituencies in multiple, so across human, non-human and living entity alike. And here our key techniques can work through complex scenarios which help envision new forms of dwelling with that in mind. I think a key practice here is it works with, not for, nor on, but nor about. So working with, this is a reframing of what has historically in landscape architecture been called stewardship. Stewardship is a working on and therefore maintaining sovereignty over land. Instead, we move to a designing with, which is acknowledges state, or the quality, state or condition that's mutual and shared, and outcomes become co-authored. Considering landscape through multiple constituencies and multiple ways of seeing to understand multiple forms of belonging, potential non-human cohabitations, and thus forms of unseen solidarity come to the fore. To enact occasions of epistemic decolonisation of our practices opens coexistence with difference. To step over the privileged ways of seeing landscape and make way for tikanga-based design futures is, I think, where we need to be heading. So to conclude, my thoughts really around repoliticising landscapes is that we need to think about these at the practice level. And what I've given us here is a sort of a sketchy outline of some of the ways in which we can all experiment with our own journeys, and potentially or hopefully we'll be tracking towards a more equitable processes and more just outcomes in Aotearoa's reforming and respatialising in the near future. Thank you very much. Ngā mihi nui.